Sounds good. Thank you so much, Tessa, and thank you everyone for being here. I know how busy you all are. I really appreciate you spending part of your afternoon with me. And as Tessa said, please do feel free to utilize the chat as a way to pop some questions in. If they are relevant to what I'm actually talking about at the time, I definitely probably will stop. I'm trying to keep an eye on that. Some questions I may hold to the end, but I will do my best to get to all your questions today. And let me get my screen shared here because, of course, we have a PowerPoint today to keep me on track and to make it easier for you to see what I'm talking about. Make sure I have my screen ready to go. Okay, so yes, we're going to be talking about equity, diversity, inclusion concepts and spending a lot of our time for the second half of this session on cultural competency specifically and what that looks like when we talk about the practices of our libraries, our organizations, and ourselves. And so our agenda today is first talking a little bit about what I call the diversity word game and those connected concepts that we need to have a basic understanding for. Briefly talk about the bigger picture in terms of issues with bias and racial and social justice in libraries and information organizations. And then how do we build EDI competencies? And when we're building those competencies, which ones do we decide to focus on? And for this session, I will be focusing on that cultural competence continuum in terms of cultural competencies and a little bit about the impact of work and what we do as individuals and also organizations. And so a little bit about the diversity word game. The reason I put this here is because I think we all recognize that there are various ways that we can define equity, diversity, inclusion, and all of the varying concepts that go with it. I always start with like this broader idea of others defining equity. So I pulled these from Bolger, who I just appreciated the simplicity of talking about equity as an approach that ensures everyone has access to the same opportunities, which we could easily apply to our field. Diversity as this idea of the presence of difference within any given setting. And then inclusion is this idea about folks with different identities feeling and or being valued, leveraged, and welcomed within a given setting. Some people tend to have a little issue with the term leveraged in the setting, can get a little dicey, but the idea though is that you're able to benefit from having someone with a different identity in your organization and actually benefit from them being there. But if we take this from the library perspective, we of course can go to ALA, and ALA usually tries to give us at least a general idea of what they think we should be doing or thinking or in the field. And we may not always agree with that, but there's a benefit to having structured definitions that are based in our own field and our own areas of expertise. And so when they started putting this together, the ALA Task Force on Equity, Diversity, Inclusion defined equity as basically not being the same as formal equality. And they wanted to make that distinction because this idea of formal equality does imply sameness, which can sometimes bleed over into ideas of being colorblind, which we typically try to encourage people not to do. But they also pointed out a few things that I think were really key to notice here. So this idea, once again, formal equality implying sameness, so wanting to be careful about the distinction there, but also this idea of the fact that we acknowledge that some groups were and still are disadvantaged in our field. And I will say that I think ALA could have gone a little further. Instead of just saying some groups, they could have been very specific in talking about both internal to our organizations and external in terms of our communities. And then also the idea of lingering systematically within organizational policies, practices, and procedures, because what they're really saying is that being excluded has a negative effect on those who work in different workplaces. And that negative effect does negatively impact the organization itself. Now, talking about diversity from that perspective is once again focused in this case on visible diversity in terms of having attributes or characteristics that are external, things that people can actually see. But they do acknowledge, and I think this is also really important and something I'm going to push us towards as well, is that diversity goes beyond what is external. There are many internal characteristics that we actually have that make us diverse and make us who we are. And this type of invisible diversity needs to be acknowledged as well in terms of thinking about how we support each other and also how we support our communities. And so this is why I tend to think about diversity through an identity lens. And focusing on that, I look at it from this idea of there being both social and personal identities. And so if you're thinking about a social identity, these are the ones that are often most visible to others and may actually be assigned by someone else or defined by someone else. You may not actually agree with an identity that is being given to you by an organization, by a group, but those are typically out there and universally accepted for various reasons. We see this a lot with the census when they ask you to check boxes to define, identify who you are. You may not necessarily agree with the boxes they give you, but they give you the boxes to check. when you have something that is socially constructed, it can be problematic, but it is something we need to recognize is part of at least our culture and what we experience here in the United States. Now, personal identities may or may not be visible to others and may or may not be assigned or defined by others, but they're typically things that we self-select. These are things that we choose to identify ourselves this way, and which often means we have to tell someone else that we identify that way. They may not be able to look at us and say, oh, yes, I know that that's part of your identity. Like one of the ones that I talk about a lot is that I identify as a knitter or a crafter. And I know we probably have lots of knitters and crafters out there as well, but people don't necessarily know that about me unless I'm doing something in front of them that indicates I'm a crafter. And so for me, it's walking around with yarn all the time, right? Or having my knitting needles in my hair, which I used to do all the time. But that isn't always going to be a way to identify me that way. So I usually just tell people that. I tell people about myself. And so something like the identity wheel that's pictured here sort of indicates that those items in the middle, when we talk about things like age or ethnicity, gender, race, those tend to be more along the lines of social identities, even though not all of them are easily figured out or discerned by looking at someone. But then personal identities can be everything from whether or not you're a smoker or a non-smoker, where you're located, how you think, whether or not you're native born or non-native born. Those are types of things that often you have to explain to someone or expose to someone, and they're not necessarily going to know that about you. And so the reason this is important for us, though, is, of course, you have to think about which identity is actually most important for you in the workplace or when you're communicating with other people. And different things are going to impact the salience of your identity. So there might be situations where I may want to tell someone that I'm a knitter, and other situations where I may not want to tell people that. But we also recognize that there are some identities that I don't have as much control over. I am not going to be able to walk into a room and tell someone that I am not a Black woman, because that's just not how it's going to work in this society we exist in. But in terms of what they see first and how that impacts how they react to me, of course, for them, it may be the most salient thing they see. It may not be the most salient thing that I present when I walk into a space, but it's something we want to think about. But we also want to think about avoiding misidentification of people. And it's not just about those fun things like being a knitter. I'm okay if someone asks me if I'm a crocheter instead of a knitter. I don't crochet, I knit. I'm not going to be too upset about that. But when it comes to things like ethnicity, racial identity, even sexual orientation, those are things that you don't want to place on someone else. And this is why we have so much trouble with the socially constructed identities. It's not my place to tell someone how they identify, but that's what happens when we have socially constructed identities. But we all recognize we use a lot of those identities to help us understand our communities and help us figure out what resources they happen to need. It is a fine line. What we talk about and what I always talk to my students about is the importance of avoiding misidentification by asking people how they choose to identify, giving them the power to tell you what their identification is versus you telling them what their identification is. Okay, so next, we skip over to the idea of inclusion. And so, of course, ALA, once again, talking about the environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, value for their distinctive skills, experiences, and perspectives, have equal access to resources and opportunities, and can contribute fully to the organization's success. And so I think it's very key that we actually look at these pieces, because this is important. When you think about being inclusive or having an organization that is inclusive, being treated fairly and respectfully probably is at the top for most people, but also being valued for having distinctive skills or experiences and perspectives, and knowing that someone's going to be listening to those perspectives, making sure that people have equal access to resources and opportunities, which doesn't always happen in our organizations, and the idea that you can now have the ability to contribute fully to the success of your organization because you exist in this inclusive society. But what I always like to do is take a deeper look at this, because if we're saying this is what we need for inclusive libraries, and we know that this doesn't always exist, I always like to ask people, what does it then look like if a library is not inclusive? So what does it look like? So I want you to take just a moment to think about this. I do have this set up on a Slido. So if you'd like to head over to slido.com and put in Bright1, so BRIGHT number 1, you can do it there, but you can also feel free to use the chat for this. But I'm be interested in what it looks like when you're in a library or information organization and it's not an inclusive environment. What are examples of the types of things that you think are happening in that organization? And this could be something you've experienced, or maybe something you've actually seen, but let's take just a moment to think about that, because here we are saying this is what it means to have this inclusive space, but we know that everyone's not always treated fairly or respectfully, or that people aren't always going to be valued. So what does that look like if we think about not having an inclusive environment? And so I'll go ahead and pull this up. And if you feel like using the Slido, feel free to do that. Hopefully it behaves itself. As always, a challenge. And even as I'm thinking about what's going to pop up here, for me, the one that always gets me is having the same access to resources. Yes, not welcoming, decisions made top down. That's always a good one. I was just working with a library where we talked about the distinction between professional development support and what was given to staff and what was given to librarians. And the fact that it really had not been thought about, that staff really didn't have that same level of support for professional development, but they often needed that same level of support. Areas that are restricted, only certain types of people will be in charge. Not seeing materials or resources that reflect who we are, the identities. Yep, having barriers in place to being able to do the work. Everyone in the decision-making room looks the same. So even if you have something that's considered to be inclusive decision-making, if everyone looks the same, has similar identities, similar backgrounds, what's happening there? Yep, having collections that don't reflect the communities you serve, morale issues. That's a big one right there. And Katrina Kendrick Davis does a lot of work on morale, low morale in libraries, which is really good reading for anyone interested in that. Patrons not feeling welcome in all spaces. Yep, programming for only certain populations, not considering that some people may not be able to attend the program or that may not appeal to everyone. Patrons don't always feel empowered to ask for what they need. Oh, I love that you used the word empowerment there. Yes, may not feel empowered and either sit quietly hoping someone asks them if they need something or they leave. That's always a little disheartening as well if you're planning things and doing things for your community and you're feeling don't realize that maybe just needed to make that step for them. The policing or security in the library, yes, absolutely can be problematic. And we recognize that safety is an issue and it's important that we have safety in our libraries, but there's also the importance of that our patrons, our users, our communities feel safe and are not being harassed by the police or security. And the ultimate one, I think that's a good one to end on, staff quitting or leaving, lack of retention. If you don't have an inclusive organization, people tend not to want to stay in that organization. All right. Thank you all for that. I really appreciate the engagement because I know how hard that is when I know you're multitasking and I appreciate it because I do the same thing. All right, so now let's switch over a little bit and talk about identity, culture, and libraries, because this is when we start talking about how these things start to coalesce for us. And so, of course, I have to try to give you a definition of culture before we can move forward. And you're going to find definitions in anthropology, sociology, psychology, business. It usually depends on the context of what definition you might need. And each of these areas will offer you something about a different way to define culture. And of course, in libraries, we will pull the definition we need to explain what we're working on at the time. I like the Peace Corps definition because I do think it at least gives us this broad view of culture as a system of beliefs or values and assumptions about life that guide behavior and shared by a group of people. So this includes customs, language, material artifacts that are transmitted from generation to generation, but rarely with explicit instructions. And so I think that's a really important piece of that it's not usually that someone's sitting down and telling you that you are part of this culture and this is what it means to be part of this culture and you're going to need to do this to adhere to that. That does happen in some cultures. Some people have what we call the cultural talk about what it means to fit in that culture, but it's not always there. Usually it's something we just develop into. We recognize we exist in that culture and it's part of who we are. But we also acknowledge that oftentimes what we are seeing when we think about culture, especially when we're thinking about how do we support our different communities based on their cultures, is we're often seeing surface culture. So we can probably name out certain foods, certain music, dances, language, literature, holidays, fashion that may fit within certain cultures. But this is just the tip of the cultural iceberg. And really what's beneath that is what we probably need to be thinking about. And this is that deep culture. And this is where we have to understand that people might have different communication styles in terms of gestures, body language. I've met plenty of people where it's not about what they say, it's about what their face says. It's about the arch of the brow. It's about the movement of the lips that tells you more about what they're actually communicating to you than what they actually say verbally to you. Also, how they handle and display emotion. What does friendship look like? What is beauty in this culture in terms of how they approach raising their children or getting married? Also, attitudes towards their elderly, how they treat their children, what work looks like. These are the things that are really more difficult for us to really understand, and really probably more impactful if we did understand them in terms of how we might approach our community and understand our community and their needs a little bit better. But this is also more difficult for us to get to. If you're coming to my next session, this is where we talk a little bit more about how do we determine this? How do we figure out what these different deep cultural aspects are, and what does that mean for the work that we're actually trying to do in our organizations? But this also leads me to give you a moment to reflect on what cultures you feel you belong to. And this is sometimes can be an interesting conversation in terms of, I know which cultures I think I belong to, but thinking about that broader definition of even having a shared language and the idea of passing things down. What cultures do you feel you actually belong to? So we're going to head back over to Slido, or once again, feel free to use the chat as well. But I'm interested in seeing how you identify your cultures. As I mentioned, as an identity, I'm a knitter. I do feel I belong to a crafting culture. I do feel that's part of my culture. I'm also a baker, and so that's part of my culture. I do identify as a Black woman, so that's a part of my culture that I feel I belong to as well. I'm a sports fanatic and a Cubs fan, and yes, for anyone who's arguing, that's a culture. And I know people who live in New York are also, you know, which team you pick is really important. And so that's a culture as well. I definitely know that I have friends who were not happy about last night's Super Bowl results because they belong very strongly to the Philadelphia sports culture, and it was not a good night for them. But think about which cultures you actually belong to as well, and let's get a sense of what that actually looks like when we think about culture. So hopefully, if I remember to activate the poll, sorry about that. Ah, yes, food culture. Oh, I love that one. Academia. Oh, and it is so much a culture. Rural community resident. I like that. Academia is getting bigger. Yep, that's going to happen. We have more people identify as being part of that culture. Disability community. A reader. Yes. City girl. I like that. Italian. Birding. I used to be a reader. Hooker, crochet, and I appreciate you putting both there. The first time I heard someone say that they were a hooker, it did not come across the way I think they thought it would. If you're not in that culture, you may not recognize the language. That's a really good example of that. Ah, fencing, hockey fan. Let's see, survivor. That's a good one. Runner, Black woman. I used to be a runner as well. Now I'm just a very fast walker. My knees can't take it anymore. Parent community. Yep, that's one we always commonly see as well. Any pet owners? I definitely know there's a pet owner culture out there, dog ownership, cat ownership, or in some cases, your cat owning you is what I've heard from others. Mother, yep, cancer survivor, absolutely. Is it evangelical? I can't even pronounce that. See, didn't even get the word out properly. Apologize for that. Dog mom and cat lover. Anime, like best. Mental health treatment. And I think what we're seeing here is look at this combination of cultures. Look at all these different things. And even if we don't necessarily belong to some of these cultures, we can recognize that this is important to the people who are in that culture, right? We can recognize the importance of that. Fitness, yeah. We could keep going with this. Christianity, See, anything else that I haven't called out yet? Cult escapee. Now that's an interesting culture. That'd be one that one day we would like to hear more about what that meant, but we're not going to do that. Spanish speaking culture. Yep. I'm actually trying to join this culture. I'm terrible at it. I've been doing Duo for almost a year and I still cannot speak a lick of Spanish, but I'm trying. I'm doing my best. And I love that the reader is bigger. I'm not surprised by this because of the community we're in right now. That reader is one of the biggest ones on the screen here. But I'm definitely seeing cat owners creep up on us. So I'm thinking we're starting to hit that stereotype, right? We all have cats. All right. I'm going to move us on because I want to get going, but I think you helped to really showcase the point I was trying to make about the variety of cultures that we all can actually belong to. And then think about how difficult it is for us to think about what that means for our communities and trying to reach all those different cultures and understand them. And then there's another culture that really impacts us, and that's actually organizational culture. And so SHRM talks about this being defined by the proper way to behave within an organization. And usually, once again, like any culture, there's going to be shared beliefs and values that are usually passed down by leadership and then reinforced through various methods. And yes, we need to acknowledge that reinforcement can be positive or negative. So you can either be rewarded for fitting into that culture, or you can actually be ostracized or penalized for not fitting into that culture. But it does shape in terms of who we are as employees, our perceptions, our behaviors, and how we understand where we work and the work that we actually do. It does set the context for everything. And it's really important that we actually understand what our organizational culture is. But we also have to recognize that organizational culture, even though it may exist and may have been in place for multiple years, isn't always a positive thing. That organizational culture can actually be very negative. It can be very difficult for people to fit into an organization, to find a way to wedge themselves in. And we also have to acknowledge that there really is not a one size fits all for this. So I worked at 4 different academic institutions, and I will definitely tell you that the organizational culture was very different at each of those institutions. And each time I had to figure out what that culture was and figure out whether or not I belonged in that culture, or whether or not I was going to be supported in that culture. And this is why we also have to remind ourselves to ask this question: what happens when someone doesn't understand, identify with, fit into, or agree with the organizational culture? Especially if that culture's been in place for, 80, 90 years and people kind of like the status quo. What happens if you bring someone into your organization and they don't quite fit in to that organization? And so we talk about this being the trouble with library culture and EDI. And what Jens tells us is that in an historic and well-established institution, so if you're talking about especially academia, but other areas as well, where you've been around for a while, the culture acts in a way to preserve the status quo. That is the whole point of the culture. Organizational culture is there to keep things working the way they've always worked. But status quo can often equal out to bias. Not always, but it can equal out to bias. And also, if you think about what the status quo is, usually it means someone is privileged. Someone has a little bit more privilege, a little bit more power in the organization, and it is structured that way. If you think about the impact on EDI, it usually means it's more difficult to implement any changes that are directly related to EDI, because that's going to change the status quo. It's going to take power away from someone who has power in that system. And typically, we don't want to give up power. And it's something we have to think about when we think about our organizations and think about the culture of our organizations. And so Wong reminds us that one of the solutions that we have in our field, which is trying to bring in more diverse individuals into our organizations, may not actually be the right solution if the organization is not actually ready to support those individuals. And so if you don't already have a culture in place that is designed to support and leverage those strengths and those differences based on identities and skills and backgrounds and experiences, then you're just going to make challenges, more challenges for those who are coming in and being identified already as marginalized or under represented or under privileged representatives of those populations. And that's something we have to think about. So one of our solutions has always been hire more people who are diverse. That's going to fix everything. Well, it doesn't fix it if the organizational culture doesn't support them. And so very quickly, bigger picture, what is the impact of this? What are we actually starting to see? And this is why I do want to briefly talk about issues of bias and also what does social justice look like? And so when I talk about bias, I remind us that there are typically 2 types, implicit and explicit. And this is definitely an oversimplification, but we could spend a whole hour talking about bias and the history of that. But if we think about implicit bias, this is when we have views that typically are unconsciously being impacted by our attitudes or stereotypes that usually have been fed to us by society, by media, by our families. You pick up your unconscious attitudes in many places. And it doesn't mean that you are a biased person. So I always like to make that very clear. It just means that even if you have good intentions, even if you go into a situation planning to be fair, implicit bias may lead you to unintentionally be biased about how you respond to someone or how you rate them or how you engage with them, because you have these ideas that have been buried into your head, in your system, that are very much more based on stereotypes than reality. Now, explicit bias is what people typically see as, when I say someone's being biased, they think of explicit bias. This is where you are very much aware of how you feel about someone, and you let other people know that I don't like this person or this group of people, and you're very clear about that. But the other thing about bias, we use this term and people automatically say it's negative. And this is going to sound strange, but bias can be positive. And what I mean by that is not positive as in good. I mean, you can have a positive bias towards something. So you can be positively predisposed to want to support someone or something because of their identity or their background or their culture. Now, of course, that usually means that there is a flip side. There's a negative side of that as well. So if you are being overly positive towards one group, you're probably being overly negative towards another. It's the give and take of that. But we do want to remind ourselves that anytime someone says bias, it's not just saying that it's negative, that I hate everything. It's also I prefer certain things. But this all means that maybe our bigger question is, what does this bias look like in our organizations? What is the impact of this bias on our ability to reach what we call social justice? And once again, social justice can be defined multiple ways. I pulled this one from the John Lewis Institute for Social Justice because I thought it was a broader reflection of what people often think of when they think of social justice, but mostly to emphasize a few things. The idea that it is a communal effort. So you as an individual can have an interest in EDI, a care for EDI, and that's definitely important, but it has to be a communal effort for us to make change in our organizations, in our systems, and in our communities. And so this idea that social justice, to reach that level, to get beyond just conversations of EDI, we do actually have to think about pushing together, having communal action, and having support as well to doing that work. But not going to spend a lot of time on this because, once again, I only get you for an hour and a half today, and I have way more to tell you. So how do we move forward? And this is where we talk about EDI competencies. This is where we talk about how do we prepare ourselves to try to do this work. And the question most people ask is, which competency do I go for? And the three that are usually suggested are intercultural communication competence, cultural competency or competence, you may see that as well, and then cultural humility. And I'm going to talk more about cultural competency later in the second half of this and how it connects to cultural humility, but we're not going to spend as much time on that. But briefly, if we're talking about intercultural communication competence, or ICC, it's really talking more about knowledge, motivation, and skills to interact effectively and appropriately with members of different cultures. And a lot of people see this as the basic entry into this process. So how do I make sure that I'm able to communicate with people and learn more about them? You may hear it called cross-cultural competence or intercultural sensitivity or intercultural effectiveness as well. But the other important thing about ICC to remember is that it's actually about the perception of the ability to communicate effectively. It's not actually about the action of communicating, and it's usually someone's external perception of whether or not you have ICC, which is very interesting. So I don't know if other people would look at me and say that I actually have ICC. I don't know. But it's more about asking other people whether or not they perceive that you have this ability. You can, of course, internally see if you perceive that you yourself have this ability. I'm not saying you can't, but it's very interesting that this is a competence that's more about how other people may see your ability to communicate, not about you actually communicating. Now, the cultural competence is probably a little bit more detailed, and we talk about this more in libraries than we do some of the other competencies. So multiple definitions exist. I'm going to throw four at you because of how they hit on different pieces of the idea of being culturally competent. Most of these, of course, are coming from either health sciences or sociology or social work. These are not definitions that we have pulled from libraries. But Hansen et al. Talk first about this idea of awareness and understanding of how different aspects of human identity, so we got the human identity piece, impact understanding of human behavior. And then also our ability to ethically and successfully work with culturally diverse communities. And so the reminder here is that you can work with a culturally diverse community, but you may not be successful in doing that work, or maybe you're not doing it in an ethical way. And it's a reminder to ourselves that it's a step above just saying I'm working with the community. It's making sure you're doing it in an ethical and successful way. Now, Chow et al. Come in and say that it's not only the ability to function in your own culture, but the ability to successfully interact with those from cultures outside of and very different from your own. And so I think we see this a lot more when we think about people who are moving culturally from location to location. So are you able to go to another culture and actually successfully interact and be successful existing in that culture? But also thinking about your own culture, we often assume that if someone identifies as part of a culture, that they're comfortable in that culture. And that's not always the case. You don't always necessarily agree with or identify with all aspects of even the cultures that you are a part of. And so do you have the ability to function in your own culture and also function in other cultures as well? Now, Wilson et al. Talk about this idea of acquisition and maintenance of culture-specific skills, because you want to be able to function effectively within a new cultural context and also interact effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. The important part of this one is the idea that this is something you can acquire, but also something that has to be maintained. So when you're thinking about something like cultural competence, it's not one class. It's not, I read one book. It is actually a lifelong commitment to being culturally competent. And it's like this ever-flowing opportunity to learn more and more about different people and about yourself as well. And then Williams actually tells us that it's the ability of individuals and systems to work or respond effectively across cultures in a way that acknowledges and respects the culture of the person or organization being served. So two important pieces here, of course, is the idea that it can also be a system or an organization doing this. So cultural competence can apply to individuals and also to organizations, but also going back to the idea of respect and building that into the process as well. So I mentioned libraries have talked about this. ACRL came out with the diversity standards. It's now been 11 years since they talked about cultural competency for academic libraries, but they put forth 11 areas where this actually fit within the work that they thought we should be doing. One, of course, was the cultural awareness of self and others, which fits very well in the definitions that we just saw, but also that cross-cultural knowledge and skills. So gaining that information about others and the reminder that it's going to be ongoing. How do we also align that with our organizational and professional values? And if our organization and profession have this actually in line, that we are in alignment with them. How we develop our collections, our programs and services, which is one of the more obvious areas that we talk about. How we deliver our services. Also recognizing that language diversity is a thing, but they talk about not just the fact that we recognize that there are a variety of languages, but the preservation of those languages and the support of people being able to hold on to their languages. Workforce diversity, which of course we talk about in our field all the time. Organizational dynamics, and this goes back to the idea of the workplace culture that we talked about. Cross-cultural leadership, so as a leader, being able to lead across different cultures and actually paying attention to the different dynamics that may impact how you respond to people from different cultures as a leader. And then the reminder that you're going to need professional education and continuous learning. So you have to advocate for that and also make sure you're participating in that. And then when you're thinking about research, that you are actually expanding the view of how you do research to include culture as an area of importance as well. Now, cultural humility is actually directly related to cultural competence, and I'll show you something visually in a moment, but the idea is moving slightly beyond just being culturally competent and trying to actually incorporate this lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and critique. So it's the reminder that you're going to have to come back and recheck yourself and really think about your own actions and beliefs and ideas as you move forward, but also this idea of redressing the power imbalances. Now, Tervalon and Murray Garcia were talking about this from the physician-patient dynamic, but I tend to talk about this from the librarian community dynamic. So as you work with people in your community, that same dynamic can actually exist, and you want to make sure that you're actually building something that's mutually beneficial, but not paternalistic, right? These partnerships are not meant to be, I'm here to save you. It's more along the lines of recognizing that communities bring their own strengths as well, and that you can actually work with them based on their strengths rather than thinking of them as someone who needs saving or thinking of them as someone who cannot take care of themselves. So if we think about this visually, we think about cultural competence being the first two levels of a pyramid. And so you're working on developing the self-awareness, and you're also working on gaining that cultural knowledge. And then once you feel like you've gotten to that level where that's feeling very comfortable for you, you start thinking about, how do I now fix some of these issues I see? I see these power imbalances in place. What do I do about that? And then how do I hold these systems accountable? When I'm thinking about the institution as well, institution of libraries, how do we hold these institutions accountable and get them to move forward so that we actually have inclusion and equity at higher levels? And that was a lot of information already, and this is why I have to take a moment to breathe myself, but I also want you to take a moment to reflect on everything I just threw at you, because I know it's a lot. Perfect time if you do happen to have questions to go ahead and pop some of those into the chat. What we're going to be spending the second half on is focusing specifically on the cultural competence, competencies, and then the idea of the cultural competence continuum as a way for us to understand how we're moving towards cultural competence and what that looks like in our libraries, including what it looks like when we are at a lower level of cultural competence and suggestions for moving past that. Also, a really good opportunity for a quick drink of water. All right. So it looks all quiet, no chats coming in. That's good. Not necessarily good, means you're hopefully still awake, but I'm going to go ahead and move us forward so we'll have more time for the Q&A at the end as well. So the focus on the cultural competence continuum, and this continuum is just one way for us to think about what it means to be culturally competent and how do we apply this to what we do in our organizations. And so the continuum, typically in this case, there are 6 segments that you can move through. And if you're looking at this more left to right, which I wasn't able to get them all on the screen left to right, but usually left to right, you're moving from a lower level of competence to a higher level of competence. So all the way to the left is cultural destructiveness. And this is where we're talking about attitudes and policies and structures that are actually in place and are destructive to a cultural group. We don't usually see this too much in libraries, even though I will say it is possible to have policies in place that are destructive to a particular group in an organization. But these are the types of things that we used to see a lot when you would think about even what we did in the US. So the Jim Crow laws would have fit very, very well within this idea of being culturally destructive, of moving of Native Americans to the reservations and also having their children go to those schools. That would have been seen as culturally destructive because the idea was to eliminate language and to eliminate culture as part of that process. So we typically don't necessarily think about that in libraries, but you want to at least keep an eye on policies and keep an eye on different practices. And yes, I hope is saying attitudes can still be culturally destructive. Absolutely, absolutely. Very good point to make. Now you move up and you get to cultural incapacity, and this is where you just don't have the capacity in the organization or within yourself to respond effectively to the needs, the interests, and preferences of culturally and linguistically diverse groups. And then at the next point, you move up to the cultural blindness level, which is this idea of viewing and treating people all the same. So it's like a lack of recognition that people are different and should be different, and that they might need different services or different levels of support. When you get to the second half, you start talking about being culturally sensitive or having cultural pre-competence. And this is where you're now aware of strengths and areas for growth to respond effectively to culturally and linguistically diverse populations. And then the level of cultural competence actually comes not at the very top, but the next level. And this is where you're able to exemplify your competence through your actions. So this is through demonstration of acceptance and respect for cultural differences. And then finally, when you are culturally proficient, this is where you are actually holding culture in high esteem and using it as a guiding foundation of your work. I think we could also take this and not even just say culture, but this is also holding EDI in high esteem and using that as a guiding foundation for your work. So if being inclusive is part of this process, and you could actually probably represent that throughout this continuum, it's making sure that you're using that as a way that you put forth different ideas, different suggestions, and you think about how you support your users and also support your colleagues and support yourself. So what does this actually look like? So if we're talking about and I didn't put one for the very first one because if typically culturally destructive is not something we usually see in libraries, can happen, but cultural incapacity, this is usually where we see issues with institutional bias. This is where we see issues with discriminatory hiring and promotion practices, with disproportionate allocation of resources, the devaluing of some cultural groups within the organization, and also reduced expectations for some cultural groups. And I'm going to show you what this typically looks like, but I also like to show this tweet that came out. It's been almost over a year now, actually almost a year ago exactly. But Dr. Monica Cox actually is not in LAS, actually works at The Ohio State University, but put this tweet out. It just hit me because it resonated in terms of how I try to describe or define organizational privilege and institutional bias. And so what Dr. Cox said is that if you want to know who is valued in your organization, ask these questions and think about the answers. And so whose stories are believed, whose complaints are responded to, who is paid the highest salaries, who is given multiple chances, whose bad behaviors are not addressed, and who benefits from organizational policies the most. And I think this is a pretty interesting thought process because I can actually go back to the 4 academic libraries that I worked in and answer these questions and recognize where certain people were allowed a little bit more leeway than others in the organization. We're able to do things that others were not able to do in that organization, which told me who was more valued in that organization compared to those who were not given that same flexibility or that same leeway in the organization. So interesting conversation to have with others. See what your answers to this question might be if you think about your organization as well. Now we want to combat this, and we could, like I said, we could do a whole session on hiring and retention in our libraries, especially when we think about trying to have this diverse applicant pool. But definitely if you're trying to combat discriminatory hiring practices, you have to work on diversifying that pool. And that does include where you advertise and how you advertise the information about your organization and about the position. And as much as we can, diversifying our search committee. This does not mean identifying someone who's visually diverse and asking them to be on every single committee, including every single search committee, but it's also making sure that there's someone there who's paying attention to EDI within that process, who's paying attention to whether or not there's potential bias in the process, and then making sure that every committee member has completed intentional bias training. But even beyond that, that they recognize the importance of that training and can apply it to what they're doing in terms of the process of hiring someone. Also, when we think about reviewing applications, there are a lot of bias possibility spots. I can call them bias trouble spots. This is why we encourage people to make sure you have a rubric. This is pretty standard in most of our organizations, but if you don't have one, having an objective rubric to rate your applicants only on the qualifications that have been advertised with the position is one really key way to eliminate some of those little, what we call creeping biases that may get into that process, that conversation. But I also encourage people to eliminate the use of fit to determine suitability for positions when fit is not being used to talk about their skill level or their expertise in terms of the fit to the position description. When fit is being used to talk about whether or not they're going to fit in the organization or fit in the community or fit in the city, then the conversation has gone off the rails. You're no longer talking about that person in terms of their ability to do the job. You're talking about whether or not they're going to be comfortable existing in that location. And usually that's something that needs to be determined by the person who's applying for the job. And typically they're not going to apply for a job if they don't think they're going to be able to live in a certain city or work in a certain place. Also, make sure that we're evaluating what they say, not how they say it. And this is not necessarily just about someone where English is not their first language, even though that is one of the things Coach Chiari was actually talking about, was making sure that we were not judging someone's ability to communicate because of a heavy accent. It's also about whether or not they use proper grammar. We look at that all the time. And I will be the first to admit that it's a problem for me as a professor because I grade and I have to grade on grammar, which sometimes trips over into my regular life. And my mother has yelled at me for correcting her grammar. So it's a bad habit. I have to knock it out. But I don't use that when I'm listening to someone talk about their ability to do their job or respond to a question. You focus on the content of what they say. And if they've answered your question, it doesn't matter what it sounded like in terms of how it came out. Was it perfect grammar? Was it not perfect grammar? Even I don't always use perfect grammar. And if you can, this idea of appointing an external reviewer for your pool and for your final candidates is just there to help you double check yourselves, just to make sure that someone is paying attention on the outside and that everyone is doing their level best to make sure that you're not going to have discriminatory practices within your hiring process. Now, this also goes over to interviews, and it's something that I always try to remind people. I've either conducted these interviews myself or sat through an interview myself, but bias kind of trickles into these interviews even when you're not expecting it. And usually it's not someone on the search committee. We call them the uncontrolled people coming to the presentations who ask questions they're not supposed to ask. But it is also important for someone who's on the hiring committee to ask all the candidates the same questions as best you can in the same order, and make sure you're scoring their responses pretty much right away and not holding on to after you've seen all your candidates. That's actually just something we do as researchers to help us make sure we're focusing on that particular individual and not focused on multiple individuals and getting things conflated. But also, of course, avoiding those biased interview questions and reminding ourselves some are illegal, and we definitely recognize some questions cannot be asked, but you'd be surprised at how some questions come across where they've been written for a particular candidate. And when you write that question for a particular candidate and you have to ask that question to the other candidates as well, that question is biased against them because it wasn't written for them. It was written specifically so you could find out information about another candidate. You also want to ensure all candidates have the same opportunities to interact with everyone and not just picking and choosing who people interact with. And then make sure that there's also this equal experience when you have an internal and external candidate. We tend to have a lot of internal candidates in our libraries. People want to move up, but you want to make sure they've had the same experience in terms of who they talk to, the questions they receive, whether they get lunch, whether they get a hotel. Those different types of things need to match so that they're getting the same experience as well. Now, the other part of this is thinking about discriminatory promotion practices. And it's just a reminder that everyone who is going to be thinking about being promoted in an organization needs the same access to promotion information, that your process needs to be standardized and should, of course, align with your institution. But if you don't have a written process, if you don't have something standardized, it's something that needs to be done because it's unfair when you have more of a word of mouth process where people are hearing different messages about what it means to be promoted, what it means to move up into a position. Everyone should have the same message about the standards and expectations. You also want to make sure that everyone has the same access to mentorship and support within the organization, that you've looked at the promotion eligibility that's based on evidence that they're presenting and not based on how we feel about someone or their likability. And if allowed, make sure you do have at least 2 external reviewers, hopefully one that can vote, because a lot of places will have external reviewers, but not a voting for external reviewer. And that kind of negates the importance of having that external reviewer there in support of the process as well. Now, also in this particular area, when you're talking about cultural incapacity, this is where we also start talking about microaggressions, because these microaggressions are when you start having the manifestation of being devalued or having reduced expectations of someone from a different culture in the field. So microaggressions very broadly are subtle slights or insults or indignities or denigrating messages that Sue et al. Actually divide into 3 different types. You've got micro assaults, which are actually very deliberate acts of harm. You've got micro insults, which are those spoken or unspoken insults that you actually see directed at someone, where people often don't recognize that they're an insult. They're not said as an insult, but they come across as an insult. And then micro invalidations are where you overlook the feelings or the experience of someone, where they may feel that someone has said something to them that's either negative for reasons based on their identity, but you tell them that's not what the person meant, or that's not, or that you tell them stop taking everything based on race or stop taking everything based on sexual orientation. And it devalues the fact that they felt invalidated at that point, which just in turn re-invalidates them as well. And actually, as you see, a question came in. Let me make sure I stop here for a moment. I've heard that it would be a good idea to hire a librarian who does hold a BA, not necessarily MSLS, but some librarians feel that this practice would weaken the value of an MLS and could lead to a negative precedent. What do I think? And I hope this question makes sense. It does absolutely make sense, Nancy. In terms of recruitment to our field and the idea of who should be hired for positions, I will say that I've worked in places where we've hired people who did not have MSLSs, and the only negative downside that I had was they had to be trained on basic library practices. And that was the one thing that was missing. They weren't trained on reference. They weren't trained on information literacy and instruction and the value of that. And so there was this extra level of preparation that that person needed that was something that I wasn't prepared to have to train someone on, but it's something I was tasked with doing, and of course not compensated for as well. But in terms of there being a strong colleague or someone who could handle the particular topic area that they had, that part was perfectly fine. So I definitely think it's something that I recognize organizations do. I think there needs to at least be an understanding that if you're hiring someone in that way, that they're probably going to need some additional training, and that's something that has to be considered when you're hiring, especially if the pool includes people who have the MSLS or the MLS or whatever degree they happen to have. And it's a reminder that maybe it's a matter of allowing those people who have that degree to get some additional training in the topic area of interest, if that's what the concern actually is, rather than maybe hiring someone who has the topic area expertise and doesn't actually have an understanding of working or functioning in a library. Either way, both groups are going to need some further education. And if the organization is prepared to actually support them, then either one's probably fine. But it's just a matter of recognizing they're going to need some additional education, additional support, and not just making an assumption that either one's going to be prepared to do that work if they either don't have the topic expertise, or if they have the topic expertise but no understanding of working in libraries at all. So absolutely, I hope that actually made sense too. I know that conversation keeps coming up, and I think it's an important conversation for us to continue having as well. And of course, I teach for an LIS program. Of course, I want you to get your degree. But yeah, back to these microaggressions. So the other thing about microaggressions, they do tend to be thought of as only like racial microaggressions. And these are the ones we talk about the most, but microaggressions can be actually about any identity you may hold. So it's not just racial, but we talk about the racial ones because they are directed at people for being part of a racial minority group. I've had many microaggressions are directed at me for being a Black woman in libraries, including the ones that were directed at me because they thought it was a compliment to tell me how articulate I was and how surprised they were that I was articulate. And I asked them, what does that mean? But it's one of those things that we don't necessarily think about. The impact of those microaggressions on people who work in our workplaces, especially when they go on for a while. So what Alabi found by talking to people about experiencing microaggressions or seeing microaggressions was that they found that if they were a minority, that they likely report experiencing or observing microaggressions a lot more than someone who identified as being white in terms of racial microaggressions, who said they were less likely to experience or even observe microaggressions happening in the workplace. Now, Aurora Ramirez also reminds us that this isn't just about colleagues. This isn't just about the microaggressions we may face from those we work with, that patrons often microaggress us when we work in the workplace. So if you have a younger looking librarian that they assume is a student and they ask to speak to the librarian, if you have a librarian of color who is, they assume you're not a librarian, they ask to speak to a real librarian. Those types of things do happen. I actually had a patron who refused to allow me to help them, who said that I asked them if they needed assistance. They said that not from me, and asked me to call someone else to assist them. So that happens in the workplace. It's just very interesting that it happens, and we're not prepared for it until it happens to us, but it's something we have to actually consider as well. And then also, this idea of microaggressions, the word many people are arguing needs to be changed, that they're not just microaggressions, they're aggressions. Because if they happen over and over, there's this negative cumulative effect as well when you get to the end of that. Oh, it looks like we have another question. So I was hired in Memphis as a library assistant. Library system has a great training program. Learned more about being a librarian there and than during my MLS program. Yeah, also worked with people given the job, but not the training, and they were not set for success. I love the connection you're making there to the idea of training preparing you to do your job. So as long as the training is actually given to you, you're able to do it even without the MLS. I acknowledge that as well, that not every MLS program is really great at preparing you to work in the field. And most institutions are going to need to do some additional training regardless of the MLS degree. So I do like to stop for a moment and ask everyone, which of the following can you say yes to when we talk about these microaggressions? I have experienced a microaggression directed at me in the workplace. I have observed a microaggression directed at someone else in the workplace. I've committed a microaggression against someone in the workplace. And so usually when I ask this question, I'm not going to make this into one of our usual Slidos, but usually when I ask this question, interestingly enough, most people can actually say all three. That based on some aspect of their identity, this has happened to them, or that they have actually committed a microaggression against someone in the workplace. What I want people to understand is that it's very easy to commit a microaggression unintentionally. The difference is whether or not you realize you did it, acknowledge it, and then go back to actually talk to the person and say, I'm so sorry about that. That was not my intent. So I think that's something that we have to also think about as well, is that microaggressions aren't always about intent, but we have to make sure that we separate intent from impact of what happens. And that's actually one of the suggestions for how to respond to microaggressions. And I'm not going to go through all these. And by the way, you're going to get access to the slides and all the links for this, because I know there's so much stuff I'm throwing at you right now. But the Granger College of Engineering put forth this idea of how to respond to microaggressions. And I thought this was a pretty interesting list, because I'll honestly say that half of these I would not do. I would not attempt to do this in a situation. I probably would use humor. That's one of my go-tos anyway. But there are a few in here that if you're not comfortable with this idea of telling someone they're too smart or too good to say things like that, that may not be your personality. So you may not do that as well. But I think it's interesting that they put forth possible ways to respond to microaggressions, because oftentimes we just don't know how to do that. We just don't know how to respond when we either hear a microaggression directed at someone else or it's directed at us as well. Yep, Jessica, good point. So microaggressions can definitely be part of organizational culture, could be standard, and actually oftentimes coming from those in administrative positions. And if they're not addressed, they do definitely continue. And people don't realize the negative impact on the person who is experiencing those. But I also want to point out that Aurora Ramirez says that maybe we should also, all those different ideas, but let's maybe focus on calling in rather than calling out. And what they're talking about is that rather than this idea that you're going to call somebody out for using a microaggression, which is often seen as being very aggressive itself, that you're going to invite them in for a conversation, invite them in to really try to explore why they felt it was okay to say that, and get them to understand the impact of their words. And once again, this comes back to your comfort and also your relationship that you happen to have with the person. It's often more difficult to have this conversation or call someone in if you don't know them, but it's usually easier if it's someone that you actually work with or engage with on a routine basis. Now, if we move over to the idea of cultural blindness, and again, this is that philosophy of viewing and treating people all as the same. This is where we start encouraging assimilation. We ignore cultural strengths. We blame users for their circumstances. Cultural competence training is not valued. And maybe requested or suggested, but not valued. You tend to have a more non-diverse workforce and no structural or resource support for cultural competence in the organization. I'm only going to focus on one aspect of this as a reminder that we all typically see in multiple libraries, but this idea of offering assistance rather than assimilation, especially if we're thinking about those who come to our communities as either immigrants, refugees, or even our international students in many cases. Many of them face issues when they think about using the library in terms of not even seeing the library the same way we present it. So they have a differing view of the purpose of a library. They have different experiences with working with librarians, sometimes not as positive. That language issues can actually be an issue. And I don't necessarily even mean that they don't speak the same language. This is a reminder that we use a lot of library jargon and that hardly anybody understands us. So maybe it's a reminder that we shouldn't be using a lot of library jargon, especially for someone who's not even used to libraries in this particular context. And then especially for those working in academic settings, different views of plagiarism. So how we teach plagiarism is not necessarily how they teach plagiarism in other countries or even how they view plagiarism in other countries. So it's really important for us to think about understanding those populations from the right perspective, and that's their perspective. Is finding out what they need based on them telling us what they need versus possible incorrect assumptions that we tend to have about those populations. Pulver and Clark made a really strong example of this list of things that they thought about their community, and they made a lot of assumptions about how many of them, because it was a Spanish-speaking community, a lot of assumptions about where they were coming from, which countries they were coming from, their culture, their cultural needs, their ability to speak English, and they found out when they talked to them that they were very much wrong about those cultures, and they needed to have those conversations. And then especially for those of us who are maybe working in an academic setting, that it's really important that we talk about understanding those cultural differences, because it's going to also impact how students especially seek information. And this includes people coming to public libraries, how they even ask questions, or even if they feel comfortable asking questions, is something we need to think about, and maybe changing how we offer them access to us and their ability to speak with us as well. Now, we talk about cultural sensitivity, and this is where we have this awareness of our strengths and our areas for growth. So we're getting there. So we call this, we're getting there. We're starting to move through the competence levels. So we value high quality service. We have a commitment to human and civil rights. Our hiring practices are built to support diverse workforces. We're able to conduct some assessments. We work to improve our service delivery. We may still have some issues based on token representation in our organizations, and we may not quite have a clear plan for how to achieve our cultural competence yet, but we're getting there. And what this looks like for us, and what I always remind us, is that this is the importance of us focusing on assessment. This is also the importance of us moving beyond just counting people based on identities. We have to do some counting. We definitely know we need to recognize when we have a problem. And if you don't have those numbers, you don't recognize if you have a problem. But it only tells part of the story. And so I teach research methods, and I scare my students by saying quantitative and qualitative. I use those words and they start screaming and want to leave the online room. But it really is about making sure that we're not only looking at the numbers, but talking to people and getting some actual textual data to understand what they need and what we can put in place to support them. But I also always encourage libraries to create not only just an EDI data plan, because that's the focus here, but you need a data plan. You need to know what data you have access to, where it comes from, and what you're planning on using it for. But also make sure you're creating action plans for the work you want to do. Because at this stage, the importance of what you're doing is actually doing something. You're actually putting action towards your different efforts. And this is why we also encourage you to think about doing a climate assessment for your organization. So if you have not done that yet, the importance of doing this means you're going to identify if you have a dominant culture that's existent in your organization. It's going to help you to identify specific issues that impact specific employees, and also try to understand the barriers and issues that those who identify as being marginalized or historically excluded may be experiencing in the workplace. Climate assessments are usually done once every 10 years, and unfortunately, that's not enough. You typically want to check on your climate a lot more than that. It's like the same thing when you want to do a community assessment, and if you haven't done a community assessment in 10 years, then you probably have no clue who's in your community now, because our communities change so quickly. People move around much more than they used to. The other thing you want to think about doing is actually reviewing your work, either as an individual or as part of departments you may exist in, because you want to try to identify where EDI practices could and should fit into your work. You want to think about identifying the EDI practices you already use in your work, and then also what barriers are you currently experiencing when you're trying to integrate EDI into your work. So this will be our final pause because we're going to run out of time here, but I want to ask you quickly in terms of thinking about reviewing your work. What barriers to integrating EDI into your work do you currently feel you face? So if you think about the work you do, and when people keep telling you, you need to be focused on EDI, you need to make sure you're thinking about being inclusive and being equitable, what barriers are you facing, though, to doing that in your own work? So this is our last Slido. Back to the bright one. And once again, please feel free to use the chat as well if you prefer, rather than hopping to another screen. And I'll usually tell people that the biggest barrier that even I face to doing this, even though I focus on EDI, when I think about trying to further build it even into my teaching and my work, is time. It's time. It's absolutely lack of time. Oh goodness, yes, board of trustees. Oh, my favorite people. I shouldn't say it that way. We need them, but we definitely know they can be a big barrier. Lack of administrative support, absolutely. Sometimes there's things you can't do if you don't have the support of those who help you to free up your time and free up your ability to do this work. Systemic issues, civil service, trouble finding time. Yep. Not knowing what I don't know. That's a great one right there as well. Yep, someone who speaks the language, attitudes of longtime staff. Yep, that goes back to that status quo, people being comfortable, not wanting to change, not knowing where to start. Yep, time and resources. Yep, the resources part as well. Hiring restrictions that are imposed. Oh my goodness, yes. I was actually talking to someone out in California and they can't even ask certain questions, let alone change things. My time to gain knowledge. Being part of the culture war, yeah, the perception of what EDI even means and people automatically connotating that with something negative or bad. Time to process the information. Yep, how do I implement, identify this? Politics, that's probably one of the best ones to put up there, politics. And then also feeling awkward asking people of color to help out just because they're there in the group. And that one I will speak on just a bit because you're absolutely right. And we talk a little bit about this idea of additional emotional labor or additional labor that we are often imposed on people with different identities to help us get a better understanding of something. And really, that's not their job, right? That's not their job. That's not why they were hired to work with you in your organization. However, there are some people who are more open to those conversations. And it can be difficult to identify them, but if you can identify them, it's a really good go-to person. Like if you're having trouble with figuring out how to do something and you think it's, oh, is this offensive? Is it not offensive? It's good to have that person who's willing to listen to what you have to say, review your work, and let you know if they think there are any issues there. But it can be difficult to find that person. And you should not assume automatically that any person who fits that identity is going to be willing to have that conversation with you. And probably thinking you don't pay me for this type of work, so why are you asking me to do that? People who are against EDI, yeah, the anti-woke crowd. Yes, I don't actually use woke because it's problematic, but yes, definitely there. And then, oh no, the governor. Okay, yep, not going to talk about that. That's definitely the political side of things, but it's problematic, especially where we exist right now. We recognize that our country's at a different place right now than it was even 5-10 years ago. Having everyone on board, in administration being honest, being afraid of doing the wrong thing, so they allow behaviors to become toxic. Yes, that goes back to that idea of what Dr. Cox was asking, who's allowed to continue misbehaving without it being addressed, and it's because of fear. It's definitely because of fear. So, all right, I'll let you keep thinking on that, but I want to move us forward so we have plenty of time for questions. By also making sure we talk about, because I mentioned in this section that you're doing good, but you might be having issues with tokenism. So it's a reminder that this idea of tokenism is the practice of like doing something like hiring someone from a minority group simply to prevent people from criticizing you. Like, hey, we hired a Black woman. Didn't we do a good job? That's not the point of hiring them. You hire them because they can do the job, not because they're going to fill that quota slot that you may have. And so you want to be careful of that, but also careful what we call racial capitalism. And this is where you get some type of social or economic impact from the racial identity of another person, where you benefit because of who they are, not because of the job they're doing, anything else. We want to avoid this. So we talk about avoiding this by, one, not creating any false imagery of our workplace diversity. This goes for our websites, any brochures we create, things like that. I've had the experience of still being on someone's website long after I worked there, because I was being used as a representative of how diverse they were when they had no other types of diversity there. Making sure that we are working towards creating a workplace that truly does reflect EDI, which means that we are hiring for those values, even if it's not someone who identifies a certain way, someone who respects diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. Make sure we are, of course, diversifying our staffing based on fair practices, though. This is not about affirmative action. This is about making sure we're hiring the right people for the right job and that everyone has the same opportunities to apply for those jobs and receive those jobs. And make sure you do create an organization that supports workforce retention, because if you have a revolving door based on someone's identity, it's not positive for your organization either. All right, so if you reach cultural competence, this is where you're actually doing the work. And so this is just a reminder that you're looking at your mission statements, your policies, your procedures and practices, and that they're integrating cultural competences into those areas, that you're including your community in all aspects of what you do, that you're implementing policies to help develop a culturally competent workforce, that you support cultural competence, and that you also have reciprocal community engagement. I'm going to talk about two of these really quickly because of how important they are. One of them is thinking about the integration of EDI into our statements, our policies, and our processes. And so this does include looking at all those things, especially the public statements, and making sure that we are actually paying attention to those in terms of leading the work we actually do. You want to be aware of using broad terms. So just using the term diverse or diversity doesn't mean you're talking about diversity in terms of your organization or your communities. You want to make sure you're separating out EDI as well. So it's great to integrate it, but you should probably have a separate statement to truly show where your organization stands on those topics, that you've set some goals and objectives specifically for EDI, and that you've created that action plan for EDI as well. And Fantasia, I see your comment. I'm going to actually look at that in just a moment. Not missing you. I see it there. The other thing I always encourage people to do is to review their policies. And we have a lot of these internally, externally, public facing, not public facing. I actually am happy to share the rubric that I've created to help people review their policies. But this is just a list of questions you should be asking yourself if you're wanting to look at your policies in terms of EDI. And a lot of these are just about asking yourself, who's the policy even written for? Who wrote the policy? Is it even still needed? Is it really meant just to deter certain behaviors, which a lot of our policies are? This is not to dismiss the fact that some policies are put in place for safety reasons. I recognize this. I recognize that sometimes we have to create a policy as a way of keeping those in the library safe, but we want to make sure that we're being careful that we're not being biased against a certain group when there are other ways to maybe deal with some of the issues that they might be bringing into the libraries, into the space. So again, I'm happy to share the full rubric, but this is the majority of the questions that I encourage people to ask themselves. And you'll get to see these when you grab the slides after the session. And then this importance of community and participatory engagement. So this includes when you're thinking about how you assess your library, how you assess yourself, outreach, planning, evaluation. You want to introduce the voice of those who are actually using your library. Also, this includes talking to your colleagues as well. And it's recognition that the knowledge and thoughts of others are just as important as that general thought that we may have about what we think we know about people. This process tends to be more inclusive, it's more collaborative in nature, and can be seen as democratic or transformative in nature. It's also time consuming, so I'm going to tell you that right now. So the process of actually spending time talking to people takes more time. And then if you want to reach cultural proficiency, this is just a reminder that you are now adding to the cultural competence knowledge base. So you're doing this work as well. You're employing experts in cultural competence because you've helped them to get there. These are people in your organization. You're mentoring others along this continuum. You're advocating for the underserved, and you're partnering with others. And what that looks like is the reminder of reaching cultural humility. So that's the whole focus, to build our pyramid, get to the top where we're actually pushing back against the system and making sure that we're redressing some of those power imbalances. So we're in the home stretch. Quickly want to talk about what it looks like to try to integrate this into our work, especially our practices. And the impact of this, of course, is being able to understand or be aware of and be sensitive to histories and legacies of oppression and discrimination in our libraries. It's recognizing that we can't shy away from that history and that we need to actually confront it and actually use it to help push forward. Also, identify and then change any policies, any practices, any standards, or any rules that are actually working against this process as well. And remember that the work is ongoing. You're not expected to do this in 6 months. You're not expected to do it in 1 year. It takes time to get this work done. It can be frustrating, and especially with the cultural competence continuum, you can actually backslide. You can backslide. You can be doing really well, and then you have something happens that doesn't fit what you were hoping, and you go back to the way of thinking, but then you can also move forward as well. As an individual, you of course can focus on getting training, self-education. I always suggest self-reflection, doing some journaling if you like to journal, making sure you're actually critically self-evaluating your own work, that you also think about being a mentor and collaborating and partnering with others in this process. And as much as you can, as safely as you can, be vocal and be persistent when you see something that isn't right, when you want to push back against something that's happening within your organization or even within your community. And then, of course, as organizations, especially our leaders, be open to change, challenge that status quo, be transparent, and definitely build in some inclusive decision-making processes so that everything's not just coming from the top down. Make sure you're supporting efforts in both words and action. So don't just say, I support EDI as a leader, actually do things to help support people who are doing that work as well. And then focus on accountability. So it's important that we hold people accountable for their actions. So this goes back to who's allowed a little more flexibility in the workplace or allowed to behave badly in the workplace. There needs to be accountability for that as well. Also, hold everyone accountable for EDI work. It's not just the work of a few, it's the work of everyone. Everyone has a role to play. And then think about forward-looking accountability. So this means that you're not just focusing on blaming people or punishing people. We recognize that mistakes have been made, that someone has been harmed because of those mistakes, but we focus on identifying a lesson and making changes so that we don't repeat it again. And so this is the idea of not allowing things to repeat, especially bad things to repeat in the organization, and not just focus on punishing one person because you assume that that person is the cause of the problem. And so that's it. I just talked way too much. I've got like 8 pages of extra slides for you all for resources, or if you want to read some of these articles that I referenced, because some of them are like a really great starter point for understanding different concepts, especially if you want to see more about the calling in about microaggressions and how to do that. That's listed in the list as well. And I'm going to stop sharing. We don't need to see that anymore. And make sure I can actually see the chat here in case we have questions. My chat keeps blinking in and out. I wanted to go back to what the comment that Fantasia was making. So recently had a conversation with past colleague regarding residencies based on race. I think they were helpful and give underrepresented groups the opportunity to have a job, but she stated there are folks in our organization who don't support residencies based on EDI. Oh yeah, that conversation is going on right now. There's a recent publication called Residencies Revisited that was just published that's really provides a lot of detail, not just about the residencies, but the experiences of those who were residents, because there can be issues with having a residency that's based solely on EDI. For one, people seeing them as a Band-Aid or as a way to solve the problem for recruiting people into the field who have diverse identities. And the problem there, of course, is that not everybody can have a residency that does that they're expensive, they're time consuming for other people. And at point now, I think we probably have about 20 residencies that are across the country that do this work, but that's still only 20 residencies and usually 1 or 2 people a year. That's not a lot. And it also doesn't allow other people to have access to that level of training. I was a resident. That was my first job for 2 years. I was a diversity resident. There's also extra work that goes into that in terms of being asked to represent the institution as a diversity resident. That was one of the things that was made very clear to me when I applied for the job. And it really was, for me, excuse me, my stepping stone. It really is the reason why I am here today. So there's positive value there. But I personally believe we should also be focusing on making sure we're supporting all new librarians who are coming into any position, any job, and giving them that same level of support to make sure they do their job well. They are, though, a recognition that new librarians from underrepresented groups often don't get that support when they start a new job. And they basically flame out after a couple of years because of the lack of support. It's recognition that many times our organizations aren't welcoming to them, and that there has to be something like this in place to get people to recognize that they need to do things differently. It does help change the status quo. I really actually like residencies in general. I think we should have more of them, and I do value the ones for EDI, but they can be problematic, and it's definitely something we should think about as a field. But definitely, if you get a chance, pick up the Residencies Revisited. I do have a chapter in there. You don't have to read my chapter, but there's really great chapters in that book where people talk about the importance of these programs and what they really mean. Yep. So Jessica said, make sure there isn't bias for patrons and listening more to them than non-patrons. Absolutely. The non-patrons, which the hardest question is, how do you even get to them, right? They're not coming in the library. What do I do? And you're right. It does take more effort. It means sometimes spending time in community centers. It means spending time out in places you don't normally go to find out where your non-users are and why they aren't using the library. What's the barrier for them as well? It can be really interesting when you talk to people who aren't patrons about what they need and realize that in some cases, because they didn't know you had it. We have a lot of great things in our libraries that people don't know about, but in some cases, it's things you never even thought about that you could easily do. And you're like, oh, we can do that. Didn't know you needed it. Okay, good to know. But you definitely have to have those conversations. And it does mean going out sometimes into the community and finding them there. Looks like we got a clap. Oh, Katie had to leave, but thank you, Katie. I know you won't get to see this except for the reminder, but yeah, it'd be great. Carolyn's reminding everyone of the CE certificate. Please do that as well. So Fantasia's saying, yep, not happening there as well. That's the other thing about the diversity residency programs. They tend to not last. There are a few that have been around for quite a few years, but some of them, they run out of funding, they run out of support, especially if there's a new dean that comes in or a new leader that comes in and the program is no more. And then a reminder from Tessa to sign up for the next program. I'll be talking about the evaluation aspects and the assessment aspects as well. So Deborah has a collections question. I'm guessing that this kind of stuff will be covered in the next session. Yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about assessment of collections. Yes, that will be covered there. But if you have a question you want to throw in there now for me to think about, feel free to do that so I can make sure I do address it fully in the next session as well. Hope says there are very different ways of thinking, believing about EDI in my library. It feels immense. Thoughts on first steps with very resistant team members. Oh, absolutely. And one of the first things that you actually any organization needs to do when you're thinking about EDI is try to come to a consensus about what you mean as an organization when you're talking about EDI. That includes how are we defining these concepts? Are we using ALA's definition? Are we using our broader organization's definition? You know, most of us who are in academia know that our universities have put forth definitions and guidelines. So are we going to use those? Do they apply to us as well? This is where we talk a little bit about the participatory process, not being just about our communities, but also being about ourselves. So having some internal focus groups where people talk about what does EDI mean to us? What should EDI mean to us? How should we be presenting ourselves when we think about EDI? Making sure that if people are unsure of where to start in terms of their own work, that there are conversations with others who do similar work and let them share. Like to me, it's always fantastic hearing from others about how they approach EDI in their work, because it's usually very different from me, which is great. And I want to hear what their approach is. And I often learn things that I can apply to my own work as well. But that first step is conversation. And the problem with that is that people don't see it as being action oriented enough, because it doesn't feel concrete. It doesn't feel like I'm doing anything. I'm still talking. And yes, a lot of libraries get bogged down in talking. They talk for years. They will talk about EDI for years and nothing happens. But if you don't have the targeted conversations, the conversations where you make it very clear that we are going to sit down and we're going to hash out what this means for us and what it looks like in our work and how we define it, and we're going to put that out for others to see as well, that's when you start holding yourselves accountable. That's when you start holding your organization accountable, where you can then point to those things. And when people say, well, why are you doing this with your collection? Why are you devoting funds to diversifying your collection? You can point to your mission statement. You can point to your collection development document and say, it's because it's part of who we are. This is the work we do, and we're going to continue doing that work. But if you don't have that initial conversation where everyone at least tries to come to, and it can be an uncomfortable consensus, not everyone's going to always agree, but there needs to be at least that level of understanding that everyone has the opportunity to have their voice heard in that process, to lodge complaints or concerns, but get to the point where you at least say, okay, well, can we concede that we all agree on this? And sometimes it is concession, but at least it's agreed upon, and you move forward from that point. And so first step, have the conversations. Don't worry too much about that first step not feeling as action oriented as having an action plan, right? That's next steps. You don't want to move forward to action plans or to objectives and goals in your strategic planning if you don't even know what you're actually talking about in the first place. If everybody's coming in with all these varying ideas of what equity and diversity and inclusion actually are, because then everyone's all over the place. And when you start to try to collect data to support your goals and objectives, you don't even know what you're collecting at all. My students get tired of me. I talk about operationalization of variables constantly in my classes. It's basically taking a concept and defining it in a way that you can measure it. And that's what you have to do with equity, diversity, inclusion as well in your own organizations. You have to take those concepts and make sure they are defined in a way where you can measure them, where you can understand them, and you can track them in your own organization. So definitely have those first internal, I call them focus groups. They can be small sessions with people. They can be done by department if that's more comfortable for people. They can be done by status level. Sometimes you want to talk to those who identify staff. Maybe you have student workers you want to talk to. Maybe you have volunteers come in the library and you want to talk to them as well. But have those conversations first. And then, yes, have a bigger conversation with the organization once all those ideas are there. This all definitely goes into that internal assessment piece that I will be talking about, because there's this importance of making sure you're talking to everyone. So Deborah says, discuss your thoughts on pulling items out of the regular collection for display diversity. Yeah, I'll definitely talk about that later. We could go on for that one as well. So here's what we have on the LGBTQ community. Here's what we have on Black community. Yeah, I definitely talk a little bit about my concerns that we're doing the holidays and heroes process for how we celebrate diversity and inclusion. And it's like, oh, great, it's February, it's Black History Month. We're going to now celebrate Black history. I'm like, you can celebrate Black history anytime you want to. You can celebrate all types of history anytime you want to. You don't need to wait for a month. You don't need to, but there's nothing wrong with pulling out some important materials to help people with furthering their education, but it doesn't have to wait for the holidays and heroes process. So. And we'll talk more about that in terms of our evaluations of our services and evaluations of how we understand whether or not we're having impact on our communities as well, because that's part of that evaluation as well. How do we understand if the work we're doing towards EDI is meaningful? And what does it mean for us to understand the level of effort we're putting forth into this as well? All right, we have about 6 more minutes. This is actually the perfect time to, if you do have things you want to make sure I focus on in the next session, I am always open to suggestions. And I'm actually already copying what Deborah sent me to put in my notes.
Dr. Bright, it's Tessa.
Yeah.
My camera quit. I don't know what happened. But I'm here. So thank you very much for the presentation. I know next week we have your, as a research methods and a data librarian and professor, you have a good presentation in store for us next week. We have some things that we could look at in the interim that you're going to send us so we can be prepared. If we have 3 minutes left. If anybody has another question.
It's like the last call.
You're getting some thank yous, which is awesome.
Welcome. I appreciate you all for being here. I know I throw a lot at you. It's like I throw like 4 hours worth of stuff into barely 90 minutes. And I'm just like, here, take it.
Well, the good thing with the way we have this set up and designed is that if the people who are here today have questions that they've thought about, they can ask them next week.
Absolutely. And yes, next week, actually, the way I've got it set up next week, that it won't be this intense, I promise. And we'll have definitely a little bit more time to have those conversations at the end as well.
That was by design. So we gave some time between these two programs so that we can do that. So thank you everybody who attended today. It looks like we had a good number of people. And Carolyn put the evaluation and the certificate information in the chat again. So please fill that out. We appreciate everybody's feedback.
Yes.
That's pretty much it. We had 2 minutes left. So I don't want to cut anybody short, but
exactly. I'll stick around for 2 more minutes. Like I will just hang out. I'm hiding in my office today, folks. All right.